Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining today's GREATsoils webinar on soil health and the bottom line with Dr. Martin from Earthcare Technical Limited. My name is Astrid Barrowman and I work for the Soil Association. I'm also organising this series of webinars, a programme which is funded by the GREATsoils programme. GREATsoils is a programme of work funded by AHDB Horticulture, including projects CP 107, 107B, 107C and 107D. Project 107B, Growing Resilient, Efficient and Thriving Great Soils, is delivered in partnership by Earthcare Technical Limited, the Organic Research Centre and the Soil Association. Before we get started today, I just want to take a moment to let you know about the control panel we'll be using. In order to avoid background noise interference, we have muted all delegates. We will be recording the session and can share this afterwards. Martin will provide a presentation and we'll then open up for questions at the end. You can submit questions via the chat window throughout the presentation and direct all of these questions to the organisers. I will then pose these questions to Martin at the end of his presentation. We'll now make a start. As mentioned, our presenter is Dr. Martin Wood, Director at Earthcare Technical Limited. I will now hand over to Martin, who will introduce himself and host today's session on soil health and the bottom line.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this presentation on soil health and the bottom line. This presentation is of the GREATsoils project, and the particular project that I'm going to be talking in relation to is CP 107B, which has two aims. Firstly, to inspire growers to develop their ability to assess the health of their soil, and secondly, to give growers practical solutions to improve soil health. This is part of a series of 4 webinars. I'm presenting 3 of them, today's webinar and 2 others on soil health and what to measure, and then in October on managing soil health using organic manures. And the 4th webinar on use of green manures and cover crops. So for today's webinar, the topics I'm going to cover are to review some of the current threats to soil, but also the opportunities that there are for growers, particularly fruit and veg growers, to consider what actually is a healthy soil, to assess soil health, how do we go about it, how do we start to think about managing the health of our soils, to summarize what the benefits of healthy soils are, and throughout the presentation, where possible, to quantify the financial benefits of soil health management. So let's go straight in and consider some of the current threats to soil and soil health. And these have been very clearly outlined by the UK's Committee on Climate Change last year. In a report, they stated that some of the most productive agricultural land in England is at risk of becoming unprofitable within a generation due to soil erosion and the loss of organic carbon. Without further action, farmers may not benefit from the opportunities of longer growing seasons. That is some of the opportunity that's presented through climate change. So these are clear quantified threats to soil. If we explore the climate change threat in a little bit more detail, this is from a very recent report. It's actually the 2017 UK Climate Change Risk Assessment. If we look at the high climate change scenario, so that's effectively the worst case scenario, the prediction is that the best and most versatile land in the UK, that's agricultural land in the UK, is projected to decline from 38% of our agricultural land at the moment to 9% by the year 2050. The specific implications of that for agriculture and horticulture are that current crop production in eastern England and in Scotland could actually become unviable due to droughty soils and lack of water. So these are really quite striking threats. The other major threat to our soils, which has been well documented, is the poor management over the past 20, 30 years. And it's well documented that our soils are losing organic matter. And I'm sure you've observed this in your own production systems as well, as many people have. Over a 15-year period, it was documented that the average organic carbon in arable soils in England and Wales dropped from 3.4% to 2.8%. That's the organic carbon content. And we know that soils, once the organic matter content drops below about 3.5%, then they're prone to structural deterioration, problems of soil structure. And there's an extreme case of poor soil structure shown on the right in that image. From the Lincolnshire Fens, an example of some of the problems of poor soil structure. On the left, you can see poor soil capping. That, of course, leads to poor infiltration of water and also problems of getting chemicals, soil-acting herbicides, for example, into the soil. Soil compaction will, to the right, can have impacts on root growth, causing poor root growth. Waterlogging, and waterlogging leads to lack of oxygen and, again, poor root growth. So clear problems of structural decline, and that's associated with a combination of reducing organic matter levels and intense cultivation. So what's so special about organic matter? Why is it so important? Well, there's a number of important benefits associated with it. Firstly, it's a storehouse of crop nutrients, particularly nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus, and trace elements. It contains a high proportion of carbon, very important in terms of climate change. It plays an important role in improving soil structure. It can have a major impact on the water holding capacity of soil, and it has an important effect on the biological population in the soil, both in terms of activity and its diversity. And I'll say more about that as we go through the presentation. Just breaking down soil organic matter a little bit further so we can try and understand what it actually consists of. This schematic diagram divides organic matter into the living and the non-living components. So about 4% of organic matter is effectively biomass, and 90% and above would be non-living material. If we look at the living component, I'll just use the cursor to point out, we've got roots constituting up to about 10% of organic matter. We've got the most visible component, I suppose, of the soil biology. That's the macrofauna, earthworms, etc., up to about 30%. And these figures are all by weight, by the way. And then the largest component of the living part of organic matter is the microbial biomass. If we then turn to the non-living component, we've got humus, which most people are familiar with the term, the stabilized part of organic matter, which in terms of the total organic matter may constitute 5 to 10%. And then a very interesting fraction, the macroorganic matter, sometimes referred to as the light fraction. And there are some suggestions that that could be used to provide a useful indicator of soil health. It's a very active fraction of the organic matter with a high turnover rate. It tends to float to the surface of the soil when it's placed in suspension, so macroorganic matter. And then again, just looking at roots in a little bit more detail in the context of organic matter. An important point about roots to bear in mind is that they're actually rather leaky bits of the plant. Plants are very good at fixing carbon through their leaves, obviously, through photosynthesis, but it's been measured that up to 40% of that carbon could actually be lost from the roots, from growing roots in the soil. So a combination of exudates and sloughed off root cells. So there's a lot of carbon going into the soil around the roots, and that has the impact on the soil immediately around the roots of really stimulates the biological activity. So we get this intense zone around the roots, the so-called rhizosphere, where biological activity is the greatest. And that starts to help to explain some of the benefits of simply keeping a living plant in the ground, keeping the ground planted rather than keeping it bare. The activity of the roots associated with those plants, and one or two farmers have really looking much more closely at simply getting even a very short cover crop, say between the harvesting of oilseed rape and planting of wheat, what could be termed a 5-minute fallow, quite a catchy phrase for that. So keeping the ground planted. So moving on to some of the opportunities, and the reason why we're very excited about this soil health initiative at the moment. The first area that's prompted this is that there are now some new sources of organic matter available to farmers and growers. The big push towards recycling organic matter, recycled plant material, composted materials, some of it containing some food material, digestate from digesters producing bioenergy, and sewage sludge, of course, which has been around for a while. And then the renewed interest in green manures and cover crops as living sources of organic matter. So there are these new sources which are being looked at actively as part of the current project that we're involved with. And then there are several new test methods which have appeared and have been commercialized. There has been for a number of years now, and it's been available for measuring the so-called soil food web, and I'll say more about that in a moment, and also the use of respiration as an indicator of soil health. And again, I shall talk more about that. So all of this really, these opportunities should be placed within the big picture, I suppose, of the challenge of food production globally. And a quote from the former Chief Government Scientific Advisor, Professor John Beddington, who stated that we need 50% more production, but on less land, with less water, using less energy, less fertilizer, and fewer pesticides by the year 2030. And if that isn't a challenge, I don't know what is. So let's move on now to consider what we actually mean by a healthy soil. And I think the key idea behind soil health is that it requires a balanced approach that involves management of chemistry of the soil, the physics of the soil, and the biology of the soil. And whereas over the past 60 years, certainly, the main emphasis on soil management has been focused on the chemistry with the readily available use of inorganic fertilizers, bag fertilizers. There's been for a good while now concern about the physical aspects of soil structure, and an increasing interest, and more recently, in the biology of the soil and how we can start to harness the biology in terms of sustainable soil fertility. So again, the challenge here in relation to soil health is to be able to manage each of these in an integrated fashion, in a balanced way. So each component is important. Of course, we can't neglect the soil chemistry. So soil testing, the standard soil testing for P, K, magnesium and pH remains important. There may be other nutrients as well, which should be analysed for. Then interpreting those test results in terms of what the crop requirement is for a particular crop in a particular part of the country in a particular soil. And there are the recommendations contained within the fertilizer manual, formerly RB209, which is currently being updated and will soon be, a new version will be available. And in Scotland, the SIUC technical notes, and also taking into account crop removal. And I've got an example in the next slide of the sort of removal of nutrients in a crop of carrots. On the left-hand side of this table, we've got a few key nutrients: phosphate, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sodium. The amounts of those nutrients contained in a ton of fresh carrots in the middle column. In the third column, the amount that's removed in a crop of 125 tons of carrots, kilograms of P. So on a good crop of carrots, that could be per hectare. And the major nutrient removal there, as you might expect, potassium, but I want to also just look at sodium as important. A lot of sodium in carrots, and we know, of course, that sodium nutrition is important for carrots, as it is as well for asparagus, for example. So we can use the nutrient removal approach as well to at least keep the levels of those nutrients in the soil maintained. What about soil physics? Well, on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see soil thin section, actually taken from a pasture soil at Thurrock in Scotland near Edinburgh, an acid brown earth. And it shows the complex arrangement of solids and spaces in that soil. Patterns of channels at a range of scales, from larger channels down to smaller channels, and large solid sand and silt particles. A complex structural arrangement. If we start to simplify that down into the basics, we can see that that soil contains a mixture of solids and spaces. In this diagram on the right, I've shown, in terms of the proportion of those two, 50% porosity of the soil, 50% spaces. That's what we mean by porosity. Now, those spaces, of course, are going to be arranged in a particular way, and the solids, and that has important implications for all kinds of soil processes, particularly important for the movement of air and water through the soil. We'll be looking at that in a little bit more detail. You can almost think of the architecture of the soil that's required for soil health. The image on the right shows a nice crumb structure and a loamy soil. And an ideal recipe, if you like, for a good soil structure, which is the three components we can recommend. Aggregates of soil in the order of 1 to 10 millimeters in diameter. And an important feature of those aggregates is they should be stable when wet. If you think about the impact of raindrops on soil, irrigation water on soil, and even just as soil's wet up, they tend to expand, and air gaps can expand and can cause aggregates to shatter. So there has to be stability to those aggregates. And then on the smaller scale, we need the spaces, or the pores as they're known, within the soil. Large spaces, greater than 75 microns in diameter. These are the transmission pores that allow air and water movement rapidly through the soil. And then smaller pores are important for holding on to water. The so-called storage pores, anything from 30 down to 0.2 microns in diameter. That's the water that plants can use. So let's move on to soil health and biology. And the approach towards soil biology tends to be in two particular ways. Firstly, we can look at the organisms in the soil. And most obviously, we could look at earthworms in the soil, but we could look at a whole range of different organisms, and I'll say more about those. Or we can look at the processes that those organisms carry out. It could be respiration, for example. And this is an example on the right of a simple test for measuring soil respiration using the so-called Solvita test. Looking in more detail at the relationship between the soil spaces, the structure, and the soil life, the soil organisms, these electron micrographs show some extraordinary examples of soil that's been sliced through to show organisms actually in situ in soil. On the left-hand side, we can see a colony of bacteria, fragments of organic matter, and a pore. In this case, a pore that's about 1 to 2 microns in diameter. So that's a pore that when it's draining with water, the suction would be at about a minus 100 kilopascals. That's just about the size of pore that plants can extract water from without exerting any extra effort. So they don't struggle to take water out of that size pore. Another colony of bacteria here in a clump of organic matter, and here is an amoeba, a protozoa in soil. Much larger organism, but amoeba will graze on those bacteria and has important implications for nutrient cycling. A couple of slides now just going into a bit more detail about what bacteria do in soil and why they're so important in terms of soil health. The first characteristic of bacteria, of course, is that they can grow very rapidly. Here's another electron micrograph of a bacterium dividing in half. And under ideal conditions, they can divide every 20 minutes. So they can grow very, very rapidly. As a result of growing and dividing, they will bring about important changes in soil nutrients. For example, those bacteria there, Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter, will convert ammonia to nitrite and then to nitrate, the process of nitrification. A specialized group of bacteria, but very important in terms of generating nitrate as a plant available form of nitrogen in the soil. If we look at organic chemicals in soil, then bacteria play important roles in both natural organic compounds, such as organic phosphorus compounds, and man-made synthetic organic compounds. Organic phosphorus is a really important pool of phosphorus in soils. This is in inositol phosphate, which is a component of phytic acid, a major organic form of phosphorus in soil. Bacteria produce an enzyme, phosphatase, which will convert inositol phosphate and will hydrolyze off the phosphate, liberating plant-available phosphate from organic forms of phosphorus. And we could, if we wish to, measure the activity of the enzyme phosphatase in soil. There are tests which research labs will use. Another phosphorus-containing compound is glyphosate, an example of a phosphonate. It has a carbon-phosphorus bond here. And there's an enzyme in soil produced by bacteria which will hydrolyze that bond and liberate phosphate from glyphosate, rendering it inactive. So the importance clearly there of bacteria and the enzymes they produce in terms of transforming compounds in soil. Microorganisms are also important in creating soil structure. This diagram shows a sand particle, silt particle, and clay particles all nicely lined up, what we would describe as flocculated clay particles, and the bacteria are embedded within that structure. They produce gums and polysaccharides which act as the glues which will bind those particles together, and then the fungal hyphae form a net, giving that stability to the structure which will help the aggregates to resist the impact, for example, of rain, of cultivation. And another important theme of soil health is the diversity of soil organisms. That's important in two main respects. Firstly, it's the diversity of organisms which gives rise to sustainable soil fertility, nutrient cycling, particularly nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, and also importantly gives resilience to soils. Resilience both to management changes, moving from, say, pasture to arable soil, and to climate change. So diversity is key to resilience. To illustrate that point and to show how the diversity of organisms contributes to, in this case, the nitrogen and carbon cycles, this diagram illustrates the interaction between the primary producer plants, bacteria, and nematodes. Plant materials being decomposed by bacteria and fungi, and I've included in here the carbon to nitrogen ratio, which is a very useful indicator of the availability of that organic material. As a result of bacteria and fungi decomposing plant material, nitrogen may well be immobilized, locked up in the microbial biomass. Ammonium and nitrate converted into microbial biomass, and then when those bacteria and fungi are grazed by nematodes and protozoa, that nitrogen will be mineralized. So we can get net mineralization of nitrogen. So the nitrogen coming out of a green manure or a cover crop may involve several cycles of that nutrient being transformed by different groups of organisms. Every time that material is decomposed, carbon is released as CO2. So you can start to see why respiration is potentially a useful indicator of overall biological activity in soil. And if we take this to the extreme in terms of the soil ecology, and there are a few examples of this, we can start to put together a soil food web where we've got our plant material being decomposed by bacteria, fungi, nematodes feeding on fungi, but we've got all kinds of different types of nematodes now. Bacterivorous, bacteria eating nematodes, fungi eating nematodes. We've got mites eating fungi. It's a complicated food web. It's got lots of channels. It's very resilient. If we do happen to take out any one of these functional groups, the system continues to function. And this forms the basis of the soil food web analysis, where some of these key groups of organisms are measured. So if we add up all of that living material in the soil, what we might call the microbial biomass in the soil, it's equivalent to having a dozen sheep in the soil per hectare. And indeed, we can measure the microbial biomass in the soil, but just to give us some idea of how much life there is in the soil. So let me move on now to look at some of the practical things that you can do about the health of your soils. The first thing you can do, and the most obvious and easy first step, is to actually go out with a spade and dig into your soil and have a look at it. Spade test is a useful first step, and everyone should do it, really. It's quick. You'll know immediately you put the spade in the soil whether you've got any compaction or not. You'll know if your soil is in got good structure. And you can identify from the colour, if you're getting waterlogging, you'll see glaying, the grey colours. In some cases, you'll smell bad egg gas coming off if you're getting waterlogging. And I've seen that under crops of lettuce, which have been over-irrigated. So very easy, but also important first step to go around with a spade and examine the soil. Samples can then be sent off to the lab for a range of tests, nutrient analysis, standard tests, other tests, respiration, etc. But whatever test you're doing, it's important to get a clear idea of the variation in soils across your field. Soils vary. Sometimes they vary a lot, sometimes they don't vary very much. But you need to know that variation in terms of understanding your field. And there's just been produced, as part of our project, an information sheet for AHDB, which summarizes the soil assessment methods that can be used. These methods were reviewed and discussed with groups of growers. We gained their feedback on which methods they thought were useful, and we've identified what they can and can't be used to indicate. So there's a fact sheet, information sheet, now available on that URL on the AHDB website. So what about managing soil health? Well, I'll give you an example of the organic matter management, a project that we were involved with in Eastern England, where compost was used over a number of years in a vegetable cropping system in Suffolk. And for up to 10 years, green waste compost with a bit of nitrogen fertilizer was compared with standard NPK fertilizer recommendations. And across the whole rotation, across 7 or 8 years, the compost-treated plots gave on average a 7% yield increase. That's on average over the whole rotation. So that's quite encouraging. If you go onto the RAP website, they have a very handy compost calculator which gives you the current financial value of the nutrients contained within compost and digestate. And the current value of 30 tonnes of compost is approximately £100. Depends how much food it's got in, but roughly £100 in terms of the P and the K. You can pretty much discount the nitrogen as being readily available, but P and K worth about £100 per hectare. And estimates from the Soil Management Initiative a few years back estimated that the difference between, in terms of soil structure, in terms of good and poor soil, you could save approximately £30 per hectare in cultivation costs by improving the soil structure. That was coming down from £100 to £70 per hectare. So there are some clear financial benefits in terms of using, in this case, compost. And then if you look at the yield and, importantly, the establishment, this was a dry year, which is important, I think, in terms of the relevance to climate change. You can see from the two photographs below that if we compare the bag fertilizer alone compared to the compost plus the bag nitrogen, clear difference in establishment of this crop of onions. These trials were carried out by Enviros together with a group of partners. And if we look at the yield increase, there was an increase of 6 tonnes per hectare of those old onions, which equates to about £800 per hectare at last year's prices. So clear benefits in terms of yield, savings in fertilizer, improved soil. And as part of our current project, we're working with a number of growers, and Philip Hubbard of JEPCO, who's trialling very short duration green manures in his salad production system. He believes that the cultivation costs are lower after cover crops. So that's encouraging. So if I can draw all of this together and summarize the benefits of healthy soils, you can expect improved cycling of nutrients from healthier soils. That's getting the biology going, and that's important, particularly in relation to nitrogen. And sulfur often mirrors nitrogen in terms of its cycling from organic matter. Improve phosphorus supply, for example, from organic phosphorus, and also micronutrients will be released alongside the macronutrients. So improved cycling of nutrients is one benefit. Second benefit, improved resilience to weather. Healthier soils will have a higher water holding capacity, so they'll hold on to more water. Some of that water, more of that water will actually be readily available to plants as well, so there's a greater reserve of water in the soil through drought periods. And then when the heavens open, we get these intense rain events, more of the water that lands on the soil will actually infiltrate the soil and be stored rather than running off and damaging the soil structures in the process. So we've got improved resilience to weather events. And with changing weather, with healthier soils, you'll be able to maintain yield at least and quality, and also there's the possibility of improving yield and quality through healthier soils. At the bottom line is that you'll improve your profitability. So that ends the webinar. Just a quick plug for the next webinar on the 31st of August, when we'll be exploring in more detail the kinds of things that we can measure to determine the health of our soils. And that's this part of the Great Soils project. Contact details on this slide here. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Martin, for a very in-depth presentation. We'll circulate a video of the presentation as well as more details about Great Soils programme after the session. If anyone would like to find out a bit more about the upcoming webinars or this programme, you can visit www.soilassociation.org/great-soils, or they're obviously all featured on the AHDB website too. Thank you very much.